Cyrus Blackwood's heart finally stopped beating in 1848, in the humid backwoods of central Alabama. He was a man who owned 200 acres of cotton and 93 people. He died as he had lived, in a huge, silent rage, staring at a crack in the plaster ceiling, as if it had personally offended him. It wasn't a tragedy that he died, it was a change in pressure. The barometer needle drops just before the hurricane hits land. The air in the three-story manor, which was a decaying monument of white columns and dark money, became thick and hard to breathe for his two sons, Elias and Julian. His death did not set him free. It made the chain tighter. The Blackwood family wasn't just rich, they were cursed. A legacy of secrets so strong that 3 generations had died trying to keep them. Not only had Cyrus built a mansion, but he had also built a prison for his own family. He wasn't going to let death stop him from guarding the key. The slaves said that Cyrus had made a deal with something that lived in the cypress swamp. This thing promised him money in exchange for keeping his line pure. They said the deal was about to end. The brothers stood over their father's body as it cooled, but they weren't sad. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. The architect had just sealed the last door, leaving the 2 men trapped in a mausoleum with the rod. What they didn't know was that their father's real will wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a weapon aimed right at their hearts, meant to finish what his cruelty had started. Elias Blackwood was 30 years old and had the same iron-hard clay body as his father. He thought of the world as a list of debts and assets, like people, land, and loyalty. It was all just math. His father's cold blue eyes and jaw looked like they had been set at birth and never learned how to relax. Elias didn't think of the plantation as a home. He thought of it as a machine, and he was its chief engineer. He believed in order, control, and the harsh math of power. He had tried his whole life to earn the respect of a man who didn't respect anything, and it had hollowed him out, leaving only ambition. Julian was like a shadow to Elias, who was like iron. Julian was like water. He was haunted and sensitive, and he could see the ghosts that the people who lived in the house tried to ignore. He had dark, restless eyes like his mother's and was good at painting, which his father hated and tried to destroy. Julian didn't just not like the plantation. He hated it. He hated the smell of the cotton gin, the sound of the overseer's bell, and the constant, simmering violence that was in the air. He could feel the estate's sickness in his own bones. The 2 brothers were not bound by love, but by a shared trauma that had turned their relationship into a knot of resentment and codependence. Elias thought of Julian as a broken part of the machine that could cause problems. Julian thought Elias was a monster in the making, a scary copy of their father. They were the 2 broken pieces of Cyrus Blackwood's soul, and now they were alone together, waiting for the lawyer to show up. They were waiting for Silas Vane, a man whose smile looked like a coffin lid opening. 3 days after the funeral, Silas Vane showed up right at noon. He was a tall, very thin man, wearing black wool that seemed to suck up the light in the room. He didn't just work as a lawyer, he lived and breathed it. For the past 10 years, Vane had been Cyrus Blackwood's closest friend. He was the only man the patriarch seemed to like, maybe because Vane was even colder than he was. He had a single leather bag that he put on Cyrus's huge mahogany desk with the care of a priest putting a relic on an altar. The study smelled like old blood, leather, and stale cigar smoke. Elias and Julian were sitting across from him, and the tension in the room was so thick that it felt like a third person was there. Vane didn't say he was sorry. He just unrolled the parchment, and his nails clicked against the dry paper. He read through the usual bequests, which included small properties, assets, and the distribution of the enslaved. And then he got to the last part. His voice got very low, like a soft, silky hiss that put you in a trance. He read, "My primary estate, Blackwood Manor, and all associated lands and properties shall pass to my sons, Elias and Julian, on one condition, and one condition only." He stopped and let the silence last, enjoying the moment. Elias leaned forward, losing his patience. What state? Vane's eyes, which were the color of dirty water, looked up to meet his. That they will have a single, healthy heir within 18 months of my death. This heir must come from a single vessel, a wife who is legally and socially bound to both brothers to forever unite the Blackwood line. The silence that came after was not silence. It was the sound of two worlds falling apart. Julian's breath caught in a strangled half-laugh of disbelief. That's not possible. It's horrible. It's against the law." Elias, on the other hand, was already doing math. His face had turned white, but his eyes were still sharp. "He can't be serious. A wife tied to both? That's crazy according to the Bible. The state would never accept it." Silas Vane smiled, his lips slowly and thinly stretching. "Oh, your father was very clear, Elias. He doesn't want the state to recognize it. He wants you to do it. One woman, one child, two fathers, to bind the blood, as he wrote." Vane turned the page. "And if you fail if 18 months go by without this one heir, or if you try to get around this clause by marrying separately," he tapped the last line, "then the whole Blackwood estate, the house on 200 acres and all 93 souls, go to me in full." The trap was now clear. It wasn't just a strange request from a dying dictator. It was a well-planned way to take away someone's property. Cyrus hated his sons Elias for being too ambitious, and Julian for being too weak, and he gave them an impossible and humiliating job, with his own lawyer ready to pick up the pieces. Julian stood up and knocked over his chair. "He left us a riddle that will kill us. He wants us to fail." "Then we won't fail," Elias said in a flat, dead voice. He was already looking past the horror and into the math. Julian's voice was low when he said, "We will find a woman." What woman would ever agree to that? What family would let it happen? Elias turned to the window and looked out at the cotton fields. He didn't look at his brother. A woman from a family? No, a woman who has no family, a woman who has no choice, a woman we can buy. You're not supposed to know this, but the darkest transactions in history weren't for gold or land. They were for blood. Elias's decision hung in the air, a poison that Julian was forced to breathe. He wanted to scream, to run, to burn the house to the ground, but he was a coward, and he knew it. He was terrified of Elias, but he was more terrified of being penniless, of losing the only home he'd ever known, even if it was a prison. The thought of Silas Vane sitting in their father's chair, owning their legacy, owning them, it was unthinkable. And so he said nothing. He just nodded, and that nod broke his soul. Elias moved with a cold efficiency. A woman from a nearby county would talk, and her family would ask questions. The scandal would ruin them before they even got started. They needed someone who couldn't be seen, whose word meant nothing in court, and who could be brought to the manor, used for her womb, and then taken care of. Elias told Vane to take care of the money and find it. Vane, whose face was a mask of neutral servitude, agreed, and pointed out that the estate was, in fact, dangerously leveraged. They were land-rich and cash-poor, a lie, of course, a beautiful, perfect lie to ratchet up the pressure, to make them feel the teeth of the trap. 2 weeks later, Elias and Julian traveled to the slave market in Mobile. They weren't there for a field hand or a house servant. They were shopping for a vessel, a womb, a sacrifice. And that is where they found Morwena. The mobile auction block was a place of profound human misery, a theater of despair that smelled of sweat, fear, and the salty tang of the nearby Gulf. Elias and Julian stood at the back, disguised in plain traveler's clothes. Elias watched the proceedings like a man inspecting livestock, his gaze cold and assessing. Julian looked sick, his eyes fixed on the ground, trying to detach his mind from his body. They watched women, young and old, paraded, poked and prodded. They watched families torn apart with the casual bang of a gavel. Then she was brought out. She was the last lot of the day. The auctioneer didn't even try to sell her hard. "Lot 47, he droned. "Name is Morwena, aged 40, maybe 45. Good for housework, some cooking. Strong, but past her prime." She was tall, with skin the color of dark walnut and hair shot through with premature gray, pulled back in a tight braid. But it was her eyes that kept them there. They were not vacant. They were not broken. They were ancient. She stood there, surrounded by the howling mob, with a stillness that was unnerving, a dreadful, patient calm. She looked old, not just in years but in knowledge. The bidding was sluggish. $10, $15. She was considered almost worthless, a body to feed with no childbearing years left. Elias watched her, a strange calculation in his eyes. Julian felt an inexplicable chill, a pull of recognition he couldn't name. "That one," Elias said, his voice low. Julian was stunned. "Her! She's too old, Elias. Father's will requires an heir." "Father's will requires a vessel," Elias countered. "A young one will fight. She'll cry, she'll be trouble. This one looks like she's already dead inside. She'll be quiet." He raised his hand. $100. The gavel broke, and the two brothers got Morwena, the old slave woman, as their own. The journey back to Blackwood Manor was silent. Morwena sat in the wagon with her hands tied and stared at something beyond the scenery that was passing by. She didn't speak, she didn't weep, she didn't even look at them. It was as if she wasn't a passenger but a stone they were transporting. When they got there, the few slaves who still worked at the manor looked at her with a mix of pity and a strange primal fear. They recognized something in her. The house slaves in that part of Alabama whispered about women like her. Root women, they called them, women who knew the old ways. Women who could brew teas to stop a heart or birth a child, or see the truth. Elias had her taken not to the slave quarters, but to a small isolated bedroom in the attic, far from the main hallway. It was a room with a single window and a heavy lock on the outside of the door. That night, Elias stood before her, the lamplight casting long spider-like shadows on the walls. Julian stood just outside the door, unable to enter, unable to leave. "You will not work in the fields," Elias began, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will not work in the kitchen. You have one purpose here. You belong to me, and you belong to my brother. You will be a wife to us both. You will give us a child. If you do this, you will live in this room and you will be fed. If you refuse, the swamp is deep, and no one will look for you. Do you understand?" Morwena looked at him. She looked from his face to his hands, and then to the door where Julian's shadow was shaking. She didn't say anything. She only nodded once slowly and deliberately, as if she knew it would be bad. That night, the plan began. It was such a deep, cold crime that words can't describe it. It was a mental and physical nightmare that Elias planned and Julian went along with. Elias was methodical, seeing it as a grim duty and an unpleasant but necessary deposit to protect his inheritance. He was cold, cruel, and effective. He would go into her room, lock the door, and come out an hour later with a stone face. Then he would walk to his study to drink. Julian. The real horror was Julian. He was the monster who didn't want to be one. He would stand outside her door for an hour, shaking, sometimes crying, and whispering sorry to a God he no longer believed in. He hated Elias and himself, but his fear of being poor and his brother's will were stronger than his conscience. Eventually, he would force his way inside, and his frantic, self-hating apology was, in its own way, more violent than Elias's cold indifference. And Morwena stayed quiet the whole time. She made it through. She was a stone at the bottom of a river, and the current pulled on her, but she never moved. She didn't scream or beg. She only looked. She looked at them. When Elias thought no one was looking, she saw how his hand twitched. She saw how Julian jumped when there were loud noises. She was picking them up. She was putting together the pieces of their broken souls, and in that dark, locked attic room, where the Blackwood legacy was so heavy, the old slave woman began to wait. A rumor that was whispered. The other slaves in the house wouldn't go near the attic. One of them, a young girl named Hetty, told the cook that she had brought a tray of food to Morwena's door and heard, not crying but humming, a low, tuneless sound that made the air feel cold. Hetty said that when she looked through the keyhole, she didn't see Morwena. She had seen a big, dark bird sitting on the bed and staring at the door without blinking. Hetty passed out and never went back to the attic. The rumor got around. The brothers heard it. Elias thought it was funny, but Julian was scared. He started to have nightmares about a big bird sitting on his chest, its claws digging into his skin, and its eyes were the same old, patient eyes as Morwena's. He drank more and spent his days in the library, trying to lose himself in books, but the house wouldn't let him. He could hear the humming in the walls and feel her presence 2 floors above him, a heavy, silent weight. Morwena only asked for a few things. She told Elias she needed a small knife to peel my vegetables. He handed it to her. She wanted to get into the garden. He let it happen, but only with guards. She would spend hours outside not picking flowers, but digging up roots like viper's grass, bloodroot, and black cohosh. She'd take them back to her room, and the attic started to smell like wet dirt and bitter herbs. She was working on something. Elias thought it was folk medicine. Julian thought it was poison. It could have been both. 3 months went by, then 4, then 5. There was no sign of being pregnant. The deadline was getting closer. Every month, Silas Vane came to see them, and each time his thin smile grew bigger. He would ask about their family's health, and his watery eyes would shine with hunger that they were starting to recognize. He was waiting to eat their bodies. The stress was making Elias even angrier. He stuck to the plan and became even more demanding and relentless. He began to think that Morwena was stopping the pregnancy by using her strange herbs to go against him. He confronted her and tore apart her room, breaking the small bowls of herbs and roots. "You won't fool me, old woman," he yelled, his hands shaking. "You will get pregnant or I will put you in the swamp myself." Morwena just stared at the broken pottery and dirt on the floor. She looked him in the eye and spoke louder than she had before. Her voice was rough from not using it, but it was clear. "You can't make life happen where death lives, Elias," she said. "This house is full of death. Yours, your father's, and your mother's." Elias hit her with a backhanded blow that made her head snap to the side. She didn't move. She slowly turned her head back, and there was a little bit of blood at the corner of her mouth. Elias, the man who was afraid of nothing, stepped back when she smiled. He ran out of the room and locked the door behind him. He could hear her soft, low humming as he went down the stairs. Julian was falling apart. The guilt, the fear, and the humming had all gotten to him. He drank whiskey and hated himself so much that one night he ended up at her attic door. It was his turn, but he just couldn't do it anymore. He opened the door and leaned against the frame. The moonlight made her look like silver and shadow as she sat by the window. "I can't," he whispered, the words coming out of him. "I can't be him. I can't be my dad." He thought there would be silence. He thought he would get a curse. He didn't think she would answer. "No," she said softly. "You're not him. You're his shadow, and you're scared of the dark." Julian fell to the floor, put his head in his hands, and told the truth. He told her everything. He talked to her about his mother, a nice woman who had died because Cyrus was so cold to her. He told her about how his father would get angry all the time, and how he was worried about the family's purity. He told her about Silas Vane, how Vane had come out of nowhere 10 years ago, how their father had taken him in, and how Vane seemed to enjoy making the family unhappy. He cried, a grown man broken, admitting his sins to the woman he was actively abusing. Morwena paid attention. She took in what he said, her old eyes fixed on the moon. She was drawing a map of his soul. She was looking for the cracks. She said only one thing when he was done: "The child will come, but it won't be his." Julian didn't get it because he was drunk and sad. He thought she was talking about God or fate. He didn't get that she was being serious. Morwena was pregnant 2 months later. There was no doubt about it. It was also, by all accounts, impossible for a woman her age to be under that much stress. It was a miracle that was dark. Elias was overjoyed, but not with joy. He was satisfied in a grim way that his calculations had finally been right. He was safe. He got the inheritance. He stopped the deal right away. Morwena wasn't a wife anymore. She was an incubator. He took her out of the attic and put her in a nice room on the 2nd floor. He told the cook to make her the best food possible. He was keeping his money safe. But Julian was filled with a new, creeping fear. He remembered what she had said. It won't be his. He watched Elias preening and taking credit for the child, and a cold sickness filled him. He looked at Morwena, who was now being treated like a queen, and saw the same patient, knowing look in her eyes. She had information that he didn't. It was strange that she was pregnant. Morwena didn't shine. It looked like she was consumed. Her face got thinner and her eyes sank deeper as her belly got bigger. It looked like she was giving the child her own life force. She spent her days sitting by the window, looking south, and humming her creepy, tuneless song. It felt like the house was holding its breath. The air got thicker and the shadows got darker. Something was happening in that house, and it wasn't just a child. It was a reckoning. Morwena's presence changed over the months. She was no longer just a prisoner, she was a force. The people who worked in the house used to be afraid of her, but now they respect her. They came to her not as a servant, but as a priestess. Dina, the cook, would sneak her gifts, like a fresh egg or a piece of ginger root, and ask for blessings. "Miss Morwena," she would whisper, "my boy's got the fever." Morwena would nod, grind up some of the herbs she had collected, and give Dina a poultice. By morning, the boy's fever would be gone. Elias was too proud to see that she had become the plantation's secret heart, a parallel power structure. He saw a pregnant slave who was pampered and controlled. He didn't see the confessor, the healer, or the quiet judge who now knew all the secrets of the 93 people who lived on his land. She knew who was stealing corn, who was sleeping with the boss, and who had sharpened a knife and was just waiting for the right time. She knew that Elias was taking money from the cotton sales and keeping it from Julian. She knew Julian had taken their mother's jewelry and hidden it. She also knew that Silas Vane was more than just a lawyer. She had heard the whispers from the oldest slaves, the ones who had known Cyrus's father. They remembered a story about a child who was born with a devil's mark and was sold south so quickly that the mud on his blankets didn't have time to dry. The month of 18 was coming up. The baby was due any day now. A thick, heavy fog came in from the swamp and wouldn't go away. It covered the manor in a ghostly white shroud. It was March 1850, and the wind howled like a woman in mourning, while the rain pounded on the windows. Morwena went into labor. It wasn't a normal job, it was a war. They called for the midwife, a white woman from the area named Goody Putnam. She saw Morwena sitting up in bed with her eyes wide open and tried to run away. "This isn't right," she whined. Elias, whose face was dripping with sweat, pushed her back into the room and gave her a gold coin. "You will see this through, or you will join her." The work took 12 hours. The noises coming from the room weren't just the sounds of giving birth. They were also the sounds of a fight, Morwena's low, guttural chanting, and the midwife's high, terrified prayers. Julian sat at the bottom of the stairs with a bottle of laudanum in his hand and his head buried in his arms, trying to block out the noise. Elias walked back and forth in the hallway outside the door with his loaded gun, not knowing who or what he was going to shoot. He was a man who was waiting for a decision. He was guarding the vault, desperate for his prize, but scared of what he might find inside. The screaming stopped at 3:03 a.m. It was replaced by a sudden, shocking silence, and then the thin, angry cry of a baby. Elias broke down the door. The furniture was all over the place, and the midwife, Goody Putnam, was in a corner, crying and crossing herself with her eyes closed. It's a boy," she said, stammering. "He's a healthy boy. His lungs are like a bull's." Elias pushed her out of the way and walked to the bed. Morwena was lying back, covered in sweat, looking tired but happy. She had a small, wiggling bundle in her arms. "The air," Elias said with a big smile on his face. He felt so much better that he got dizzy. He had won. He had won against his father. He had won against Vane. He reached out to get the kid. "Let me have him." "Look at him first," Morwena said in a low, gravelly voice. She slowly took the blanket off. When Elias looked down, the world ended. It was a healthy baby boy. But his face was a picture of a truth that couldn't be true. The child's skin was dark, like his mother's, except for the left side of his face. The skin was as white as bleached bone and as white as the cotton his family sold. It went from the middle of his forehead down across his eyelid and across his cheek in a perfect, stark line. The hair above that patch was white as snow, though. It was a mask that was alive and breathing and had two colors. Elias Blackwood didn't yell. He made a sound, like a man who had been stabbed, a high, whistling intake of breath. His victorious smile turned sour and froze on his face. "What is this?" he hissed. "What kind of witchcraft did you do?" Goody Putnam, the midwife, quickly got up. "It's a mark, the devil's mark. I've seen it. They call it piebaldism. It's a taint in the blood, sir. It's a family mark." Elias turned on her, his eyes full of fire. Get out of my house. And if you ever talk about what you saw tonight, I will find you and cut your tongue off." The midwife ran away, tripping down the stairs and into the storm. Julian had come to the door because he heard the silence and then the scream. He also saw the child, but he reacted differently. It wasn't anger, it was a sickening realization that something supernatural was happening. He looked at the baby's face, which was a perfect two-tone mask, and then he looked at Elias. Julian whispered, "Oh my God," and put his hand over his mouth. "Come on, Elias. You've seen that face before." Elias was frozen, and his mind was racing as he tried to deny what he saw. "It's a trick, a flaw." Morwena said from the bed, "It's not a trick." Her voice was weak, but it had a lot of strength. "It's the truth. It's the Blackwood blood coming to the surface. It's your father's real face." Finally, putting the pieces together, the whispers, the nightmares, the sickening sense of familiarity, Julian looked at the child and said the name that would shake the house. He choked out, "It's Vane." "My God, Elias, it looks like Silas Vane." The name was in the air like a death sentence. Silas Vane was a tall, thin lawyer who smiled like a coffin lid. In his fear, Julian finally remembered where he had seen that mark before. Vane was very careful about how he looked. He always wore shirts with high collars and had long hair on one side. But Julian had seen him once years ago, riding in the rain, his hair plastered to his head. He had seen the bright white patch of hair on his temple. He had seen the edge of the lighter skin. He thought it was a scar, a disfigurement. Now, seeing it perfectly replicated on the face of this child, he understood. It wasn't a scar, it was a signature. Elias, his mind a fortress under siege, refused to believe. "It's a coincidence, a horrible birth. It doesn't mean anything." "It means everything," Julian fired back, his voice cracking with a hysterical energy he'd never possessed. "Don't you see? Why else would Father choose him? Why else would he give him so much power? Why would he give him the estate? He's not just a lawyer, Elias. He's family." The implication was so vile, so destructive, that Elias's hand went to the pistol on his belt. "If you say that word," Elias whispered, "I will kill you." "He's our brother," Julian said, the word finally spoken. "Our half-brother, the one Father sold, the one with the devil's mark, and he's been playing us. He's been playing us all." And from the bed, Morwena, holding the two-colored child, began to laugh, a low, soft, terrible laugh. "Took you long enough," she rasped. "You're not as clever as you think you are, Elias." Elias turned on her, his control shattering. He lunged at the bed, grabbing her by the throat. "What do you know? Tell me!" His fingers tightened, but Morwena didn't struggle. She just stared at him, her ancient eyes filled with contempt. The baby, sensing the violence, began to wail, its small face contorted, the line between black and white stark and accusing. "Stop!" Julian screamed, pulling Elias back. "You'll kill her! You'll kill us all! Vane is coming! He's coming tomorrow to see the heir! What do we do?" The reality of the situation finally punched through Elias's rage. Vane. The deadline was met. The heir was born. Vane was coming to inspect the product, and when he saw that child, when he saw his own face mirrored back at him, he would know that they knew. The game would be done. Elias said, "We hide the child," and his mind went back to its cold, practical state. We tell him the baby died at birth. We buy more time." Julian's voice shook as he asked, "And Morwena, she knows." Elias's eyes were as cold and flat as a snake's when he looked at Morwena. "Then she will have to be silenced forever." He was talking about killing her, which was a cold, simple deal. But before he could move, Morwena spoke up, her voice strong and clear. "Don't touch me, Elias, or you'll never find what you're looking for." Elias stopped. "What?" "Your father's other will," Morwena said. "The real one." The room was completely quiet, except for the sound of the rain on the glass and the child's crying. Elias looked at her. "You're lying. Vane had the will." "Vane had the will your father wanted him to have," Morwena said. "Your father was a snake, but he wasn't stupid. He didn't trust Vane or you. He kept a second document, a failsafe, and I know where it is. This was the biggest risk. Was she lying? Or had she learned the last secret of the house during her months of silence?" Elias's mind, which was built on lies, couldn't find its way. He was stuck between the ghost of his father, the revenge of his secret brother, and the impossible knowledge of this old woman. "Where?" he asked. "Show me," Morwena said. "And if you are lying, I will show you." She pointed to the door with her head. "When Silas Vane gets here, I want to see his face when the truth finally comes for him. And Elias, I want you to promise me something. Both of you." Julian nodded like an idiot. Elias just looked. "Promise me," Morwena said, "that when this is over, my son and I will be free. You sign the papers, give us horses and money, or I swear on my mother's grave that I will let Vane take this house and burn it down with all of you inside." Elias, a man who had never talked business with anyone he owned, looked at the child with the two-colored face, which could ruin him, and then at the woman who held it. He was in a checkmate. "Agreed," he said with a hiss. "Now we wait for the lawyer." Silas Vane showed up the next morning, right when the fog was starting to clear. He walked into the manor, his black boots clicking on the hard pine floors. His face was a mask of polite, predatory worry. "Congratulations, gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I heard that the heir has arrived. This is good news. The will's conditions have been met." Elias stood at the top of the main stairs, making it impossible to get past him. "He was born last night, a boy." "Wonderful," Vane said, his eyes shining. "I have to check the child's health, of course. It's just a formality." "Of course," Elias said, his voice sounding empty. "He's in the mother's room, this way." Julian stood behind Elias, and his hand shook so much that he put it in his coat pocket. He looked like a man who was going to die. The pragmatist, the shadow, and the ghost all walked down the hall to Morwena's room. Elias opened the door. The curtains were drawn, and the room was bright. Morwena was rocking in a chair with the baby in her arms, wrapped in a clean white blanket. Vane walked in with a smile on his face, and then he saw the child. It wasn't a gasp or a scream. It was the sound of a man's soul being pulled out of his body. Silas Vane stopped moving. His smile didn't just fade. It broke, like glass. His eyes, which were muddy and cold, got bigger, and all the blood left his face, leaving his skin a waxy, tallow-like yellow. He looked at the baby. He looked at the perfect, sharp line that ran down the middle of the child's face. He looked at the white shock of hair. His own hand slowly rose to his own temple, as if it were being pulled by an invisible string. This is where he kept his own mark hidden. He looked at the child, then at Elias, then at Julian, and finally at Morwena. In that 1 second, all of his calmness, all of his carefully planned revenge, and all of his predatory confidence went away. He was no longer the lawyer or the puppet master. He was just a scared, marked boy looking at himself in the mirror again. He finally managed to say, "What is this?" in a voice that was barely audible. "It's the heir," Julian said, and his voice was surprisingly steady. "It's the Blackwood heir." "No," Vane said softly, as he stepped back. "No, that's not possible." "Is it?" Morwena said from her chair. Now her voice was strong and deep. "Or is it the one truth you couldn't control, Silas? You thought you could play God with this family, but you didn't know that God was already playing with you." Vane's mind was racing as he searched for a new script, a new lie. It's a trick. This thing, it's not the heir. It's tainted. It's a mule. It's this woman's bastard." He was sputtering, and his mask of control was completely gone. "It doesn't count. The will says that the heir must be pure." Elias growled. "The will says there can only be one heir. And he is unique, isn't he? But you're right about one thing, Vane. The blood is dirty. It's dirty with your blood." Vane didn't lunge at Elias. He lunged at Morwena. You did this. You conjured this." He was going for the child, but Elias, moving like a snake that was about to strike, grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The plaster shook because of the impact. Elias snarled, "You will not touch her." His face was only a few inches from Vane's. "Stand there and tell us, brother, why you did it." The word brother hurt Vane more than the wall did. He sagged, the fight leaving him. In an instant, the big, patient plan for revenge fell apart. Julian looked at Elias and saw not a monster, but a man in deep, bottomless pain for the first time. Vane whispered, "He sold me," and the confession came out of him. "Because I was born like this, he sold me for a hog. Our father, Cyrus Blackwood, sold his own son." He pointed a shaking finger at the baby. "His pure line, his perfect legacy. He couldn't stand the sight of me. He told my mother I was stillborn and sold me to a trader passing through, all for this." The story came out of him like a flood of poison that had been held back for 40 years. He grew up on a sugar plantation in Louisiana, which was like hell on earth. But he was smart. He learned to read from an old Bible that someone threw away. The overseer's books taught him how to count. He learned that money and the law were the only things that had power in the world. He ran away when he was 19, went to Philadelphia, and pretended to be white. He did work. He saved. He worked his way through law school, and every breath he took was driven by one goal: to go back to Alabama and kill the man who had thrown him away and destroy the pure Blackwood line that he had been told he wasn't worthy of. "When I came back," Vane said, his voice empty, "he didn't even know who I was. His own son. I became his lawyer and most trusted advisor. I made him more paranoid. I made him cruel. I wrote that will for him." "Elias," Julian said. "You? Did you write it? Did you want us to fail?" "Of course I wanted you to fail," Vane yelled, his anger changing shape, pure rage. "I wrote a will that was impossible. A wife who belongs to 2 brothers. It was embarrassing. It was meant to make you fight and miss the deadline, so the son he threw away with bad blood could take everything. The name, the land, the house. I would have sold you both to the South just like he did with me." Elias was staring at him, and a new, cold understanding was dawning. "But the gene, this sign, did you know it was in the bloodline?" "I hoped it was." Vane hissed. "I wasn't sure. I thought that by putting you in a tight spot and making you find some base vessel, the old blood would show itself, that you would have a tainted heir, and I could use that to disqualify you. But I never thought this would happen." He looked at the baby, the perfect, beautiful, and terrible flaw in his plan. "So you planned it all? The debts?" Elias said, and everything fell into place. "You told us the estate was failing. You lied." "I moved the money," Vane said, with a strange, proud smile on his lips. "I've been taking money from this estate for 5 years and putting it into accounts in New Orleans. You would have gotten a shell, a bankrupt husk, even if you had succeeded. I was going to buy it myself at auction for a few dollars. He was a genius, a monster, and a genius. He had played them all and used their father's own cruelty to get back at them. But there was one piece that didn't fit." Julian said, pointing to Morwena. How did she know?" Vane's eyes darted to Morwena. His expression soured. I sought her out. I'd heard whispers back in Louisiana of an old root woman from the same lands as my mother, a woman who knew the old stories. I found her in that market in Mobile. I told her part of the plan. I told her we would expose the Blackwoods. I told her I'd free her once it was done." "You lied to me," Morwena said, her voice cutting through his. "You never planned to free me. You planned to leave me here, a slave bound to this tainted child while you became the new master. You are just like him. You are Cyrus Blackwood's son through and through." "It doesn't matter," Vane spat, regaining his footing. He was correct. He had lost the element of surprise, but he still had the law on his side. "The will is the will. I have the only copy, and I say this thing is not a valid heir. It is a monstrosity. No court will accept it. The estate is mine." "That's where you're wrong," Morwena said, her voice as calm as the eye of the storm. She rocked the baby back and forth. "You have a copy of the will, but you don't have the only one. Do you, Julian?" Julian looked at her in confusion, but then he remembered what he had told her about his mother. My mom's jewelry?" he stammered. "What about it?" "Where did you hide it, Julian?" Morwena asked, her eyes boring into him. "Where did you put it after your father tried to sell it?" "In the old library, behind the loose brick in the fireplace. I put her locket and rings in her old sewing box." "Julian, go get the box," Morwena said. Julian ran out of the room like a man in a dream. Elias and Vane stared at each other, a silent fight between two men who had just realized the game wasn't over. Vane turned to Morwena. You've been living here for 10 months. How could you know?" Morwena said, "You think you're the only one who listens? You think you're the only one who knows how to wait? I've heard this house scream its secrets every night. I've listened to Julian's guilty soul, and I've been places you haven't. I've been looking." Julian came back, pale and shaking, with a small sewing box made of rosewood. He gave it to Morwena. She took it and opened the lid with one hand. There was more than just a locket and 2 rings inside, on top of the faded velvet. There was a folded piece of old parchment that had turned yellow with age and was sealed with Cyrus Blackwood's own wax seal. Silas Vane saw the seal and jumped. No, it wasn't a piece of paper. It was a bomb. But Elias, who saw the move coming, slammed his elbow into Vane's solar plexus, making him gasp in pain and double over. "Give it to me!" Elias yelled, holding out his hand to Morwena. Morwena looked at him and then at Julian. "Julian, read it," she said, as she gave the parchment to her younger brother. "Your voice should be the last one to end this." Julian, whose hand was shaking, broke the seal on his father's letter. He opened the paper. It was dated a week after Vane's will. It was a codicil, a last will and testament. Julian started to read, and his voice broke. "I, Cyrus Blackwood, being of sound mind but a damned soul, do hereby amend my last will." He read on, and his eyes got bigger. The paper was a confession. It talked about Cyrus's sin, which was the birth of his first illegitimate son, Silas. It proved that Vane was the father, but it kept going. Cyrus didn't trust Vane because he was paranoid. He thought his new lawyer was too eager and too perfect. He had done his own research and found out something that Vane had never known. There were others besides Vane. Julian stopped reading and his face turned pale. He turned to Elias. Elias told him to read it. Julian took a deep breath. It says, "And knowing my son Elias is not my son, but the result of my wife's affair with her cousin, a fact I have kept secret to protect the family name, I know he is as cold and greedy as I am, and knowing Silas is driven by a revenge I deserve, I set them against each other." It is my final judgment." The world changed. Elias Blackwood was not a member of the Blackwood family. The name he had given up his soul for and the purity he had been raised to protect were never his. Just like Vane, he was a fake. His father had an affair and had a son with her. He used this son as a weapon for the rest of his life. His father made up his whole identity so that he could be a part of this machine of payback. He looked at his hands like they were new to him. It's a lie," he whispered, but he knew it wasn't. It made everything clear. It told him why his father had hated him, why he had driven him, and why he had given him this impossible job. He wasn't putting his heir to the test. He was punishing his wife's illegitimate child. Julian's voice was flat and dead as he read on. "So, my true and only legitimate heir is my son, Julian. To him I leave everything." Julian's eyes were empty as he looked up from the paper. He was the next in line. He was the only one who owned Blackwood Manor, the weakling, the shadow, and the drunk. And this baby that Morwena was holding was not the heir at all. He was just the key, the biological proof of Vane's identity. It was a key that had just opened the wrong door. Vane laughed, a high, thin, screaming laugh that echoed through the house when he saw that everything he had worked for, his revenge, his inheritance, and his victory had turned to ash in a single second. "He beat me," Vane laughed, his eyes full of tears. "That old bastard! He beat me! He beat all of us!" Elias wasn't laughing. He was a man whose whole world had been emptied. He was nothing. He didn't have a name, an inheritance, or a future. He had tortured his brother, raped this woman, and planned to kill for no reason, for a lie. He looked at Julian, the new owner of the house. He saw Vane, his fellow bastard, crying in a corner. He looked at Morwena, the slave who had outsmarted them all, and then at the child with the two-colored face who had started it all. He, Elias, was the only one left with nothing, no blood, no claim, and no reason to be there. His cold, practical mind, which was the only thing he had ever trusted, broke. He whispered, "If I'm not a Blackwood, then no one will be." His voice was so calm that it was scary. He took the gun out of his belt, but he didn't point it at Vane. He didn't point it at Julian. He pointed it at Morwena and the kid. Julian yelled, "Elias, no!" But Elias was already pulling the trigger. Morwena moved at the same time. She had been waiting for this and knew it was the time. She threw the heavy rosewood sewing box at his face, and it hit him perfectly. It hit him in the temple. The gun went off, and the shot missed, breaking a mirror on the wall. The noise was deafening in the small room. The baby cried. Seeing his chance, Vane lunged at Elias, finally giving his rage a physical target. The two bastards fell to the floor in a tangle of arms and legs, biting, punching, and gouging. They weren't fighting over money anymore. They were two animals in a cage, trying to kill the reflection of their own pain. "Julian, now!" Morwena yelled, her voice like a commander's roar. "The fire, like you said!" Julian, who had been frozen in fear, came to. This was what she wanted to do. The real plan was to not only find the will, but also to destroy the house. He ran out of the room and grabbed the lantern that Vane had left in the hallway. Morwena ran after him, holding the baby. The sounds of the fight behind them were horrible grunts and screams, as well as the sickening crunch of bones. They didn't turn around. Julian ran to the big staircase that his dad had been so proud of. He stared at Morwena. She nodded. "Burn it," she said. "Burn everything." Julian turned the lantern upside down, spilling oil on the century-old dry wood of the banister, the welcome mat, and the velvet curtains. He lit a match, threw it, and then threw it again. The fire didn't start. It blew up. The old fabrics, dry wood, and trapped humidity of Alabama all caught fire in a single violent whoosh. The flames roared up the stairs, blocking off the second floor right away. In a matter of seconds, the house that had been a prison turned into a fire. Julian and Morwena ran out the front door with the baby, choking on the smoke, and onto the lawn. At that moment, the study's windows blew out, sending glass flying everywhere. The house was dying, and it was screaming. The 93 people who worked at Blackwood Manor had gathered at the edge of the trees, drawn there by the gunshot, and then the sound of the fire. The light danced around them, making their faces look hungry. They were watching their prison, their hell, and their whole world burn down, and they were happy. They watched Julian, their new legal master, stand on the lawn and breathe heavily. They saw Morwena, the old woman who had become their secret queen, calmly move the blanket around the child with the two-colored face. They were free. The fire set them free. There was one last horrible scream from the second floor, from the room where it all ended. There was no way to tell if it was Elias or Vane. Maybe it was both a last unified cry from two men who were both bound by the same father's sin and burned by the same fire. All night long, the fire burned. By dawn, there was nothing left but a forest of blackened chimneys standing against the red sky, like the gravestones of a monstrous family. The Blackwood legacy, the purity, the paranoia, the pain, had been cauterized, erased. When the magistrate from the county seat finally arrived, he found a scene of total destruction. He found Julian Blackwood sitting on the grass, covered in soot, looking utterly serene. Julian, the last true Blackwood, was a free man, but he was also a broken one. The magistrate said he couldn't take care of his own business because the trauma had broken his mind. The fire was a blessing in disguise because it destroyed not only the house but also all of Cyrus Blackwood's ledgers, debts, and Silas Vane's complicated web of lies. The estate was said to be a total loss. The banks that Vane had been paying off had no one to collect from. The 93 slaves, with no master, no house, and no property to be tied to, were simply scattered. They walked away. They vanished into the Alabama wilderness or headed north or simply found new lives. They were free in the most chaotic, terrifying, and absolute way. And what of Morwena? She was not one of them. When the magistrate asked Julian about the old woman and the marked child that other slaves had talked about, Julian just stared at him with no expression. "Woman? Child?" he'd said, his voice a hollow echo. There was no one else. Just me and the fire. The fire ate everything. Morwena and her son had vanished. They had walked away from the fire before anyone else, melting into the pre-dawn fog. Taking with them the horses and the small bag of gold, Morwena had asked Julian to retrieve for her before he'd lit the match. She had not been a victim. She had not been a vessel. She had been the architect. Where did they go? Some say Morwena took the child north to Philadelphia, where a baby with a two-colored face could be seen as a curiosity, not a curse. People say she changed her name and his name, and that he grew up to be a great speaker. His face was a living symbol of a divided nation, and he spoke with the fire of two bloodlines. Others tell a darker story, one that the descendants of the Blackwood slaves tell in secret. People say that Morwena never left the swamp. People say she went back to her old ways, that she and the boy lived in the cypress maze, and that she became the swamp witch that travelers feared for the next 50 years. People say that even when the moon is not out, you can still see a strange light moving through the trees and hear a low humming sound on the wind. They say she is still waiting and making decisions. The truth, like the child's face, is a thing of two colors, a story of slavery and a story of liberation. a story of sin and a story of survival. We will never know for certain because history is not written by the survivors. It's written by the people who own the paper, and Morwenna, she had no interest in paper. She cared about fairness. It was never just a story about a haunted house or a bad family. It's a story about what we get from our parents. Everyone gets something from their parents. For some people, it's land or money. For others, it's a stain in the blood, a secret, or a cycle of violence that we have to repeat or have the guts to burn to the ground. The Blackwood brothers were slaves to their family name. They turned into monsters to protect their inheritance because they were so scared of losing it, not knowing that the inheritance itself was the poison. The only person who was really free was Morwenna, the woman who was legally property. She was free because she had nothing to lose, and because she understood something the brothers never could. That real power comes from what you know and what you're willing to do with that knowledge. They thought they were buying a womb, but they were really buying a judge, a jury, and an executioner. They wanted to keep their bloodline pure, but instead they brought forth the truth that showed their blood was the most poisoned of all. But the question that keeps me up at night, even after the embers have gone cold, is whether it was all a coincidence. Was Morwenna just a smart, patient woman who saw a chance and took it? Or was she something else? Was it just herbs and gut feelings? Or was it that old-world magic that slaves talked about? Did she just find the will, or did the house show it to her? Was she just at that auction by chance, or was she called there as a vessel for a much older, darker justice? Did she just give birth to a child with a genetic mark? Or did she, in that dark attic, brand the child with the truth, making his face the key that would unlock the whole horrible machine? We want to think that the world makes sense, that it's just ledgers, laws, and bloodlines. But the story of Morwenna and the child with two faces makes us think differently. It implies that history possesses significance, that the truth will inevitably emerge, and that at times it manifests in a form we cannot and must not ignore. This case was never just about one family in Alabama. It was a look at the evil that people can do, the evil that makes a man sell his own son, and the evil that makes another man burn the world down to get back at him. It shows us that the past is never really gone. Sometimes the darkest secrets of history aren't just buried in the past. They're alive and well, and they have a face that shows us who we are.